The book of Genesis is the book of beginnings, the beginning of everything except for God himself. We've seen the beginning of the heavens and the earth, the beginning of mankind, the beginning of marriage and the family. We've seen the beginning of sacrifice and the beginning of the gospel. Genesis 3:15 says that there will be a seed of the woman who will come to crush the head of the seed of the serpent. It was the promise of a deliverer. After the flood, there was the beginning of human government. We are now coming to the beginning of nations here in chapters 10 and 11. These two chapters go together. Chapter 10 gives us some genealogies, but chapter 11 tells us what happened that led to God dispersing the nations. Chapter 11 tells us what happened. Chapter 10 tells us the results of what happened, the dividing of nations. Because of man's propensity for sin and his potential for great evil, God divided people up into nations as a check against their rebellious nature. Well, let's just dive right in, beginning in verse 1 of chapter 10. Now, this is the genealogy of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And sons were born to them after the flood. God told humanity to be fruitful and multiply after the flood, and they did. And it's fascinating to consider that everyone here in this room is a descendant of Noah and can trace their lineage back all the way back to Noah through one of these three sons, or a combination of these three, because people have migrated to different parts of the world. There's been marriages and intermarriages and so on, but it all goes back to one of these three. And altogether, we're going to see a list of 70 nations. Though this is probably not an exhaustive list, many scholars believe this is the oldest ethnological list in the world. And the list begins with Japheth, then Ham, before focusing in on Shem. It's moving from the lesser to the greater importance relative to Israel. And it's through Shem that will come Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the 12 tribes of Israel, and then the Messiah, the one who will crush the head of Satan, the seed of the promise, who we know is Jesus Christ. It's through him that the whole world will be blessed. So we're going to begin by looking at the table of nations. It's referred to as the table of nations there in chapter 10, beginning with the descendants of Japheth in verses 2 through 5. And you'll see a map we have up here, generally describing where these tribes went. This is not overly detailed, but it gives you a general direction of where these three sons and their descendants went. First, the descendants of Japheth. In verse 2, the sons of Japheth were Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tyrus. If you recall if you move back to chapter 9, look at chapter 9, verse 27, we saw where Noah pronounced a blessing upon Japheth. It says, "May God enlarge Japheth, and may he dwell in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant." The name Japheth means to expand or to enlarge. So when you look at chapter 9, verse 27, it's saying, "May God enlarge, because that's what his name means. Japheth and his lineage generally made their migration and settlement in Europe and became the basis for what is called the Indo-European language. And for millennia, the ancient Europeans were known as uncivilized, ungodly barbarians. That's their history. Some of the worst atrocities ever committed are on record as being by the ancient Europeans. But there was a change from their dark ages and their dark ways to move to a more enlightened stage where they followed the God of Shem, the true and living God, the Judeo-Christian God. When the Judeo-Christian God was adopted by and large by the European people and it moved across Europe, then things changed. God blessed them because of that. They grew, they expanded, and enlarged their territory, even to the point of settling from Europe to North America and being among the first settlers to open the doors to migration of people from all over the world, even to our nation itself. God enlarged them. Now, I mentioned a language group called Indo-European. This goes back to Japheth. Now, that term, Indo-European, I know that sounds contradictory, but when linguists want to get to the root of our language, they'll go to India and they'll study ancient Sanskrit. because originally the peoples settled ancient Europe, Iran, India, and some of those areas, even Central Asia, they sprung out from there. So the language root goes all the way back to Sanskrit. So that's Japheth. And then we see his sons, Gomer. Gomer settled in Asia Minor, the Gauls, Galatia, originally going to that direction, but then they expanded westward into parts of Europe. From Gomer came the Germanic peoples, from whom came most of the original peoples of Western Europe. Now, this is a generalization. We don't have time to go. You can study this on your own from century to century, how these things moved out. But this is generally Western Europe, including the original French, Spanish, Celtic settlers, England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales. So that's Gomer. And then Magog was the forefather of the ancient Russians, Slavs, Bulgarians, Bohemians, Poles, and Croatians. According to Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian, Magog was the father of the Scythian race that became the people of Russia. Then you have Madai, the father of the Medes who settled in Persia. The Medo-Persian Empire will come out of Madai. You see that in the book of Daniel. From this individual and his family came the people who filled up India, Iran, Afghanistan, and the Kurdish people. Understand, the Iranian people are not Arabic people. They're from an entirely different lineage. And their animosity with other Arabic nations goes far beyond whether they're Sunni or Shia Muslims. This animosity, even with other Middle Eastern nations, goes all the way back to these two brothers, Shem and Japheth, who happened to settle next to each other, and their animosity goes that far back. Then you have Javan, the ancient Greeks and the Macedonians, what some believe were the Romans and eventually the Italians. Then you have Tubal and Meshach. Ethnologists and anthropologists trace those two names to two Russian cities, Moscow and Tobolsk. And then we have Tyrus, and according to Josephus, Tyrus settled the far coast of the Aegean Sea of Asia Minor. Now it breaks down to the sons of Gomer. Verse 3, you have Ashkenaz, Riphaz, and Togarmah. Ashkenaz, those people that settled north of Judea, what's called the Fertile Crescent. Togarmah is ancient Turkey, parts of Asia Minor, and the Armenians. Then you have the sons of Javan. Verse 4, the sons of Javan were Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. Tarshish is believed to be ancient Spain, even perhaps the Gibraltar area, or even England. Linguists see a connection between Kittim with Cyprus and Dodonam with Rhodes. Verse 5, from these the coastland peoples of the Gentiles were separated into their lands, everyone according to his language, according to their families, into their nations. The sons of Japheth had no immediate impact or relationship with Israel. They moved north. They will later, and they definitely will in the future when you get to Ezekiel 38 and 39. I'm not even going to touch Ezekiel 38 and 39 this morning. We've got enough ground to cover. But you see those names again brought up in future prophecy. Then you get to the descendants of Ham. And again, you see the map where they moved westward. The sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. The descendants of Ham populated Africa and other parts of the Middle East. The name Cush is an ancient name for Ethiopia. It's all over the Bible as that, as Ethiopia. But the descendants of Cush apparently divided into two branches early on. Some of them founded Babylon, notably Nimrod, and others founded Ethiopia. Mizraim is the ancient name for Egypt. Put refers to Libya, the region of North Africa west of Egypt, and Canaan refers to the peoples who originally settled the land we think of today as Israel and its surrounding regions. Then you get to the sons of Cush. Verse 7, I'm only going to mention Sheba and Dedan. That's part of Saudi Arabia, those two countries. And then verse 8, Cush begot Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. We read that in our English translation and we think, oh, he was praised by God for his hunting prowess. He was a great hunter. But this was not a compliment. Nimrod was a mighty one on the earth, but not in a good way. The name Nimrod means, let us rebel, let us revolt. And the context here is that Nimrod was a mighty hunter against the Lord. The terminology implies antagonism against and in opposition to God. He was an offense before the face of God because he wasn't a mighty hunter of wild game. Nimrod was a hunter of men. Nimrod was a warrior. Nimrod was a dictator and an oppressor of men and an offense to God. We'll talk more about him in the next chapter. Verse 10, in the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria, and he built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Ir, Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah, that is the principal city. Nimrod was the founder of Babel and many other cities, including Nineveh in Assyria. He was the head of both of those cities, and that's significant because the two people groups that will exile the Jews from their land are the Assyrians and the Babylonians. So Nimrod, he becomes this ancient archenemy of the soon-to-come Jewish people. But Babel was the first organized rebellion of humans against God. Nimrod was building his kingdom, it says. He was a dictator. He was a tyrant. In fact, Nimrod was a prototype of the Antichrist rebel who will come in the last days. He is the ultimate prefigure of the Antichrist. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 tells us that in the last days, the Antichrist will do mighty works on the earth, and he will also oversee a kingdom known as Babylon. We see that in Revelation 17, chapter 17 and 18. So the past is the key to the future. Babel means gateway to God in its original language, Bab-El. That's the name in Babylonian, gateway to God. But the name in Hebrew is confusion. So if you're Babylonian, this is the gateway to God. If you're a follower of God, of Yahweh, it just means confusion. I love that those two names together work that way because one illustrates the view of man, the other illustrates the view of God. This is how we see our city and ourselves. This is a gateway to God. The other is how God sees the city and sees them. It is confusion. It's all confusion, and God will confuse them in chapter 11 with the language change up that we will see. So Nimrod was building his kingdom in the land of Shinar. Then in verse 13 and 14, you have the sons of Mizraim. Notably, the Philistines come from the sons of Mizraim. Then you have the sons of Canaan in verse 15. Canaan begot Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, the Jebusite, the Amorite, and the Girgashite. Those are familiar names that will pop up over and over throughout the Old Testament. Afterwards, the families of the Canaanites were dispersed, and the border of the Canaanites was from Sidon as you go toward Gerar, as far as Gaza. Then as you go towards Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim, as far as Lasha. These were the sons of Ham, according to their families, according to their languages, in their lands and in their nations. The sons of Ham were perennial enemies of Israel. And now we finally come to the descendants of Shem in verse 21. And again, the map you see that's the core there of the Middle East. The rest of the book of Genesis focuses on the lineage of the sons of Shem, from whom will come the seed of promise. Verse 21, and children were born also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth the elder. The sons of Shem were Elam, Asher, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. Most ethnologists believe that Eber is the beginning of the Hebrew people. The root word Eber is the origin of the word Hebrew. The Eberu people, or the Hebrew people, come from Eber and those who settled after him. From Shem comes Elam, who is an ancestor of the Persian peoples, at least in the southwestern part of Persia. Asher, who was the father of the Assyrians. These Shemitic Assyrians replaced the Hamitic Assyrians of verse 11. Assyria later became a powerful empire noted for its cruelty. Then Lud was the father to the Lydians who lived for a time in Asia Minor. Aram was the father of the Aramaeans, who also were known as the Syrians. Arphaxad was the ancestor of Abram and the Hebrews. Now, from Aram will come one of the three Bible languages that we have. You have Hebrew, which is the Old Testament. Aramaic is in the Old Testament book of Daniel. And then you have Greek in the New Testament. The Aramaic language comes from Aram and his descendants. Aramaic is the language Daniel spoke in Babylon, and it's the language that Jesus and his disciples probably spoke the most that we read in the New Testament. Because when the Jewish people came back from captivity in Babylon, they spoke Chaldean or Aramaic. That was the language of the captivity, and it became the language of the land, even though Greece became the common language after it took over and Alexander the Great's conquest. But in that land, among the Jewish people, Aramaic was spoken. Then you have the sons of Aram in verse 23 of Uz, Hul, Gether, and Mash. Job comes from the land of Uz, and Uz is the area of northern Arabia, or today parts of Jordan. Then the sons of Arphaxad, verse 24, Arphaxad begot Selah. Selah begot Eber. To Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, meaning that's when the languages divided the peoples. It was in his day. And his brother's name was Joktan. And then all these names after the son of Joktan are all associated with various Arabic peoples. Verse 31, these were the sons of Shem, according to their families, according to their languages, in their lands, according to their nations. These were the families of the sons of Noah, according to their generations in their nations. And from these, the nations were divided on the earth after the flood. So here's the table of nations, 70 nations in all listed. The genealogies of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But chapter 11 now focuses in on their dispersion over the earth and why the dispersion took place. We come now to the third major event in human history. We've had the fall of man, the flood, and now the Tower of Babel here in chapter 11. Chapter 11, verse 1, now the whole earth had one language and one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. So there was a time when humanity spoke one language instead of thousands of languages like we have today. And people wonder, well, what was that language? They don't really know, so I'm not going to guess. Some people would think it's Hebrew, but I don't know that for sure. That would be a total guess. So I'm gonna punt on this particular question. I'll let you study that on your own. But it does say that, you had one family. Of course, they all spoke the same language. But as it grew, things are about to change. But they settled. Everyone settled. All those tribes and nations, all those descendants up to a certain point that I spoke of in chapter 10, they all settled together on the plain in the land of Shinar. Shinar was in Babylon, established by Nimrod. In Genesis chapter 9, verse 1, when Noah and his family got out of the ark, God said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And they have been fruitful and they have multiplied, but they did not spread out and fill the earth. They all congregated together. In verse 3, then they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. They were supposed to spread out over the earth. They were to fill the earth, subdue it. But instead of spreading, they are coalescing in defiance. They're saying, let's gather together and let's build a city. And we'll build a tower that can reach all the way up to the heavens. And you notice they used certain materials showing that this wasn't only disobedience to God's command to fill the earth, it also demonstrated that man didn't believe God's promise to never flood the earth again. They used baked bricks, they didn't have stone in that area, and asphalt for mortar. This city and this tower were both strong and waterproof, just as Noah used pitch or asphalt material to waterproof the ark. This suggests that the Tower of Babel was constructed to protect humanity against a future deluge, a future flood. Josephus commented on this. He said, "The construction has also been seen as an attempt to withstand another worldwide flood as seen in the events of Genesis 6. This could be man's attempt to build their version of an ark because they didn't trust God's promise to not flood the earth again. I mean, consider how all these post-flood generations probably lived in terror every time it stormed really hard or they encountered a severe local flood, but they couldn't see the rainbow. Maybe whether it was the clouds or whatever, they couldn't see the rainbow that was there to confirm that they wouldn't be wiped out or for disobeying God again. And a few generations of that fear, and along comes Nimrod with a plan that unites everyone to work together for a common cause, even if some people didn't understand or get the true meaning of what they were doing. But he's saying, let's build a city. Let's build a tower. You know, fear and ignorance of God's word are no less potent today as it was then. You know, fear can lead us to build things and do things that really they become a symbol of our lack of trust in God. That's something for us to consider, the things we're doing, the things we're building. Why are we doing those things? Are we trusting God in those things? Well, here, that's what this is a demonstration of. So understand, this isn't just a monument. This has religious purpose. It was an attempt to reach the heavens by their own strength and abilities. It says, let us make a name for ourselves. Just like Cain, who built himself a city, he named it after his son. This is humanism. The motivation for their construction was to build ourselves a city. They meant it to be their city, not God's city. It's not that building a city or living in a city is wrong. After all, in the Old Testament, God will choose a city of the Jebusites to house his name forever. And what's the name of that city? It's the holy city of Jerusalem. In fact, the name of the ultimate city will be called New Jerusalem. After the present heaven and earth are destroyed, John looked up and he saw a city coming out of heaven, and he called it New Jerusalem. It's not that God is down on city life or building a town. It's building a city by man, for man, excluded from God to elevate their own pride and intellect and strength in defiance of God. So the question is, what is the motivation? What is the motivation of our efforts in the things that we do? And notice their goal was the heavens. I don't think that that's a reference to the heavens where God lives, but that it was to reach high into the sky, into that level of the atmosphere, into the sky. For what purpose? Likely as an observation tower to the heavens. There are lots of archaeological discoveries that have found 7-level towers made of mud bricks called ziggurats. They were used to stargaze and to worship the zodiac. And they would climb up the steps of these 7 tiers, and at the top was thought to be the chamber that housed the presence of whatever god they were worshiping. And they looked to the stars for direction, and they worshiped the stars of heaven. Instead of looking to God, instead of trusting God for their future, they said, well, let's read our own future. Let's get our own direction from the zodiac, and let's assign meaning to the stars rather than getting it from the God who hung the stars and created the heavens and the earth. This is really the beginning of false religion as well as secular humanism. They divide, they'll vary from one another, but they both have their origins right here. And one of the reasons I don't believe they were building a tower in order to reach up to where God was is because the plain of Shinar is basically at sea level. I mean, if they thought they could possibly build a tower that would reach up to heaven, they might have gotten a head start and started on a mountain nearby or something. But it's more of an astrological observatory. And we know that many astrological and occultic practices have their history as far back as Babylon and the city of Babel. But understand, this tower was real. This isn't just a story that was made up. The Greek historian Herodotus said the Tower of Babel still stood in his day, and he had seen it. Today, it's nothing more than a watering hole about 55 miles south of Baghdad, Iraq. In the early 80s, Saddam Hussein was trying to rebuild it. That didn't work out, but that's what he was trying to do, to rebuild the Nebuchadnezzar's empire and all of that. But here, mankind came together and said to God, we don't believe you. We're going to build a waterproof tower for our own protection and to observe whatever we can for the knowledge from the heavens that we can get. This is our city. This is our project. We don't want to be scattered over the face of the earth. Verse 5, chapter 11, verse 5, but the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. Now, this could be what's referred to as a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ, a theophany. We'll expand that idea more as we go through Genesis, that he came down in physical form, or it's just a personal way of speaking, putting divine concepts into human things that we can wrap our minds around, that God's working in some way, that he actually came down. But the point is, from God's perspective, he had to stoop down to see it. No matter how tall this was, whether it's 100 meters tall, as some projected it was, he had to stoop down to see it. Verse 6, and the Lord said, indeed the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they begin to do. Now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. God recognized the tremendous potential of fallen man working in community. Notice it says this is what they begin to do, meaning this is only the first act of rebellion in this one place. If left to themselves, more such acts will follow. The potential of fallen man working together is powerful. We have great potential for achieving great things, but we also have great potential for achieving terrible and horrific things. We have great potential for wickedness, not good. Genesis 8:21, we read a few weeks ago, the Lord smelling that a soothing aroma, then the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done. Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked, who can know it? And consider the accomplishments of evil from humanity from the 20th century onward, just from that time onward. The great endeavors of men and nations have often had terrible and deadly results. We find this in the huge death toll of totalitarian and communist governments throughout the 20th century. Some estimate that there are as many as 100 million people have been murdered by communist and totalitarian states in the 20th century alone. And just think from a technological aspect, just all the inventions and the advancements we've made as mankind, making these massive technological leaps in the last century. But it's accomplishments for mankind. It's for us, for our conveniences. And in our fallen state, working together, coordinating together, we are capable of some tremendous evil. God saw this, and he pumps the brakes on their development of that evil, and he does it to slow their development. Verse 7, come, let us go down, a reference to the Trinity there. Let us go down and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore, its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. Babel, what was intended to be a gateway to God, became a place of confusion, because the Lord confused the language of all the earth. Today, there are approximately 7,000 languages spoken on earth, not to mention all the different dialects of those languages. So we know that confusion. At the United Nations, there are rooms with headphones and translators because we need to communize the communication. We can't make any plans or work together or do anything unless we communicate. Of course, now, some of you may have apps on your phone that translate things really fast. I think you can put in a language, you can go to another country, speak in English, and then turn around and it speaks Japanese or whatever language it speaks back. We've got apps for that, like we have apps for everything else. But this forced separation of humanity here from Babel was really more about God's mercy than his judgment. Because in dividing humanity, both linguistically and geographically, God slowed down the collective rebellion of fallen humanity. So the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the earth, we see in verse 9. And so these families would multiply rapidly and develop their own culture and their own distinctive biological and physical characteristics that would be influenced probably largely by their environment. Up to this point at Babel, all humanity probably looked the same in terms of what we would call race or ethnicity. These variations and divisions began to become more apparent as humanity divided over time after Babel. Now, we don't know how all this works out, but it's unknown as to exactly how all of that works. But one possibility is that as different languages came into existence, groups of people that spoke that one language moved away with others that spoke the same language. And in doing so, the gene pool for a specific group shrank dramatically. And as the group no longer was intermingling with other populations to mix with, and in time, certain features were emphasized in these different groups, all of which would have been present as a possibility in the genetic code, going back to Adam and Eve, that there's all of these possibilities, but then honing those as further inbreeding, if you will, at least among certain groups, occurred through the generations, the gene pool grew smaller and smaller to the point that people of one language family all had the same or similar characteristics. That's one of the best explanations that I've heard about this. Now, this whole account of what happened at Babel with its anti-God dictator and its organized rebellion against God and its distrust of God's promise demonstrates that humanity didn't improve morally or in relation to God since the flood. Yes, there's now government organization that made humanity better off, but it didn't make humanity better. More specifically, what we have here is humanity coming together as one in what could be called a global conspiracy against God. To conspire together against God to say, we don't need you, we will do this ourselves. This was man's first attempt at creating a global utopia. There have been and there will be more and more attempts to create a global utopia leading up to the final attempt, which we will see in Revelation chapters 17 and 18, which I believe is after the rapture of the church when the restrainer is removed, the Holy Spirit removed. Mark Hitchcock put it this way, Satan's ambition has always been to bring man back to Babylon under his rule. This will finally happen according to Revelation 17 and 18. Both the city of Babylon and the false religious system of Babylon will be resurrected in the end times. So understand, God is against a one-world government because it leads to despotism, which is the exercise of absolute power over people. And a global government will inevitably get into the wrong hands because, as Lord Acton put it, all power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Because of our fallen nature, that is our tendency. There will be no utopia this side of heaven. We understand that. So when people say, well, we could fix all of our problems if we just come together. When you hear about globalism or one world governments, well, understand it's evil and is based on humanism and occultism, not from seeking the Lord. Because humanism, it says, well, we're basically good, and we can figure all this out ourselves. It doesn't recognize our fallen nature and what we are capable of when we're not seeking the Lord together. Understand, the Bible, it's not just about how to get to heaven. It tells us how to live now, here on earth, personally and as a society. And God is dispersing the nations. He's dispersing power. He is decentralizing government as a safeguard. So God instituted nationalism as a deterrent against that. Now, here are some examples of this push for globalism today. You don't have to look very far. Globalism is being pushed all over the place. But this goes back to the Humanist Manifesto 2, written back in 1973. We have this up here? Yeah, we do. We deplore the division of humankind on nationalistic grounds. We have reached a turning point in human history where the best option is to transcend the limits of national sovereignty and to move toward the building of a world community, a system of world law and world order based upon transnational federal government. That's their own words from the humanists. Now, this next one, this is from a private paid speech to a Brazilian bank in 2013. Hillary Clinton said this: "My dream is a hemispheric common market with open trade and open borders. Sometime in the future, with energy that is as green and sustainable as we can get it, powering growth and opportunity for every person in the hemisphere." This secret speech, basically no one would have known about this except for the release of the Podesta emails obtained by WikiLeaks. It was kind of private. But now we all know what she really said. Understand, hemispheric or even regional governance is a step towards global governance. Now, to be fair on the political aisle of things, in March of '91, in his speech before Congress, after the end of the Gulf War in Iraq, President George H.W. Bush outlined what he called a new world order that would be organized around international communities, this regional governance and working together along those lines. Our current Vice President, Kamala Harris, said this: "We're going to be increasing the requests that we're making of our allies in the United Nations." She said, insisting that the United States must institutionalize and internationalize the migration issues. This has to be a function of an American priority, but we are a neighbor in the Western Hemisphere, she said, noting that she has been working with the United Nations to obtain help from the international community. Now, please understand where I'm going with this. We want diplomacy with other nations. We want to be good neighbors to those around us. We want to have trade and work with other people, but not globalism, not relinquishing our national sovereignty to global entities, global organizations like the United Nations, the World Health Organization, or the World Economic Forum, and the list goes on, of groups trying to globalize and get power over nations themselves. And there is absolutely a push for globalism today. You're all familiar with the name Rockefeller. This is what David Rockefeller said recently. He says, "For more than a century, ideological extremists have seized upon well-publicized incidents to attack the Rockefeller family for the inordinate influence they claim we wield over American political and economic institutions. Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will." And then he says this: "If that's the charge, I stand guilty and I'm proud of it." They're not hiding this. There are many pushing their own global agendas. Understand, this is man's desire to be God and to make a name for himself, to say, let's gather together, let's build a tower, let's build a city, build a tower that can reach all the way up to the heavens. We don't need God. We can figure these things out ourselves. But here, God stopped the tower for now. In fact, God's going to stop the tower every time until we get to Revelation 17 and 18, and that doesn't last real long. God dispersed the nations, and he did it for a reason. And these are 70 nations that are corrupted by the Tower of Babel. Now, you might think, well, this would be a great place to stop. No, we have a lot more to go. Because you need to know this. God will create a new nation not tainted by the Tower of Babel. The nation of Israel started independently from the effects of the Tower of Babel. Israel is formed after the tower, not as a result of the tower. And that's what upsets God when Israel is desiring to be like the other nations. God's like, no, you're not supposed to be like the other nations. So now we get the rest of the line of Shem all the way to Abram. Verse 10, this is the genealogy of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begot Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. After he begot Arphaxad, Shem lived 500 years and begot sons and daughters. Arphaxad lived 35 years and begot Salah. And after he begot Salah, Arphaxad lived 403 years and begot sons and daughters. Salah lived 30 years and begot Eber. After he begot Eber, Salah lived 403 years and begot sons and daughters. Eber lived 34 years and begot Peleg. And after he begot Peleg, Eber lived 430 years and begot sons and daughters. Peleg lived 30 years and begot Reu. After he begot Reu, Peleg lived 209 years and begot sons and daughters. Reu lived 32 years and begot Serug. After he begot Serug, Reu lived 207 years and begot sons and daughters. Serug lived 30 years and begot Nahor. And after he begot Nahor, Serug lived 200 years and begot sons and daughters. You see, the lifespans are rapidly decreasing after the flood. But this is the genealogy of Shem, and it's of special note because it will eventually be part of the Messianic line. Verse 24, Nahor lived 29 years and begot Terah. And after he begot Terah, Nahor lived 119 years and begot sons and daughters. Nahor was Abram's grandfather, and Terah was Abram's father. The promise made way back in Genesis 3:15 to bring forth the deliverer from the seed of the woman would find its fulfillment through this family. Verse 26, now Terah lived 70 years, begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. This is the genealogy of Terah. Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran begot Lot. And Haran died before his father Terah in his native land, in Ur of the Chaldeans. This is the first mention of Abram there in verse 26. Abram's name will later be changed to Abraham. And I'm doing my best to not confuse the two as we go through this. I may slip and call Abram Abraham, but he's not called Abraham yet. But we know Abraham is a great man of the Bible. He's mentioned 312 times in 272 verses in the Bible. He's arguably the most famous man in the Old Testament and certainly one of the most influential men in history. In fact, we're going to see through the book of Genesis, this book covers all over 2,000 years of history, more than 20 generations, yet almost a third of the book of Genesis focuses on the life of this one man, Abraham. Verse 29, then Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and the father of Iscah. But Sarai was barren. She had no children. She was unable to bear children. This would have created not only the emptiness that couples feel when they're longing to have a child and they're unable to have children, but there would be the added awkwardness for Abram because Abram's name means exalted father. Can you imagine Abram introducing himself to people, walking across the path, and, hey, what's your name? Oh, my name is Abram. My name's exalted father. Oh, how many kids do you have? We don't have kids. That would sting every time he had to do that. Yet this lack of children will play an important role in God's unfolding plan of redemption. Verse 31, and Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out with them from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan, and they came to Haran and dwelt there. So the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Abram and his family were pagans initially. Abram's father and father-in-law manufactured idols, and they worshiped idols. But God will get a hold of this one man, Abram, and through Abram and Sarai, who will be Abraham and Sarah, God will reach out to the whole world through the Jewish nation, through the Messiah, and through the salvation that comes through Jesus Christ. That's where this is headed. Though God divided and scattered the nations at Babel, so he brings the nations together in Jesus Christ. Regardless of our nationality or ethnicity, we're all brought together through the work of Jesus Christ. And we find this remarkable illustration of this on the day of Pentecost described in Acts chapter 2, where instead of God dividing the nations with different languages, God brings them together with the miracle of language, and they're speaking unknown languages so people can hear the gospel or the praising of God in their own language for the people who were there. So you see that wall beginning to come down. And that was a way of God bringing humanity together again in Jesus Christ. But ultimately, it's in heaven. Revelation chapter 5, verse 9. They sang a new song saying, "You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain and have redeemed us to God by your blood out of every tribe and tongue and people and nation." That's the scope of redemption through Jesus Christ. People of every tribe and tongue and people and nation will be in heaven with the Lord under God's authority. At the Tower of Babel, they wanted unity, but they wanted unity under their own authority. Heaven is under God's authority, and it's in heaven where we find the perfect theocracy with Jesus Christ as our King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Let's pray.